Good morning, those of you who are on the stream. I will be starting the whole show here in just a few seconds. In fact, I think I'm going to do it right now. All right, here we go. Well, good morning. Well, wait a second here. I thought I had this recording set correctly. All right, you are listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered with me, Jack Stockwell. It is the 15th day of December, 2025. A mere two weeks, 2 weeks from 2026. Uh, tons of stuff to talk about this morning. Welcome to all of you. I'm glad that you're here with me. I have an awful lot of things that are going on in my business that is keeping me from developing the stream end of this as far as I want. But I'm just going to just take a nice, good, easy hour with you this morning as this three things I want to talk about. This Iranian Venezuelan shadow fleet oil tanker that was seized by the U.S. military somewhere off the coast of Venezuela. 5 oil tankers. Well, so I think it's 5 so far, isn't it? That have been blown up, sunk, badly damaged in the Black Sea. The Russian oil tankers, and I think one was off the Western African coast. Ukraine claims 3 of these, but who's behind these other 2 attacks on Russian oil tankers? I mean, is it a coincidence that the U.S. government has resorted to piracy at a time when the Kiev regime is out there sinking oil tankers? And then just what happened here at I guess it's Bondi. I thought it was Bondi I thought they named the beach in Australia after our Attorney General. But I guess it's Bondi in Sydney, Australia to mark Hanukkah, leaving 15 of them dead, many more injured. The deadliest mass shooting of Jews anywhere since the massacre by a right-winger at a synagogue in Pittsburgh back in 2018. The Bondi Beach, more information on that, but attack appears to have been carried out by 2 Australian Muslims of Pakistani origin. Was this spontaneous violence motivated by revenge for Gaza? If so, it comes at the worst possible time for free speech in Australia, that is for certain. Finally, some rare guilty confessions by the British government this week. Hopefully I got time to get into this. The British government said this: yes, we have active duty soldiers in Ukraine. And they said something else very interesting this last week. Yes, we know the COVID vaccines are dangerous. But no, you can't see our data. All right, so let's get going here. This moment is now here, and it is with just, my goodness, such violence that most people who have not been thinking about the inherent mistakes of the present financial world system are being taken by surprise. If you've been listening to my program and other programs at K-Talk, you shouldn't be surprised by what is taking place. But those who are not K-Talk educated don't quite understand how things can fly around the way that they do. They just recognize that the old order, especially the so-called unipolar world, which was attempted to be established at the end of the Cold War, it's gone. It's not disappearing. It's not packing up and leaving. It's gone. It's over. It's finished. And not only is there a huge rift between the so-called global West and the global South, there's now a breaking up that's going on in the transatlantic community. I mean, after Trump administration published this new national security strategy, everything is in turmoil. And the Europeans are in a complete state of frenzy. People who have been staunch Atlanticists for their entire lives are saying things like, we can no longer regard the United States as an ally. And the Danish Secret Service even wrote a 62-page paper saying that the United States is now a security threat for Denmark. Things like that are happening all the time. And if you look at the content of the new National Security Strategy paper, which I said last week has just changed everything, it's quite a mixed bag, actually. It has positive and negative elements. I would say that the most optimistic one is that it definitely says that the continuous expansion of NATO has to end and that there should be no more NATO expansion. I think that's the way it said it. And that's probably the most positive thing in that entire paper. No more NATO. Now, also in the positive category is that it wants to normalize relations between the United States and Russia. And it doesn't quite say normalize. I think what it said was cessation of hostilities. I think that's the formulation, I think. Which is good because it reflects a wish to bring the Ukraine war to an end. I mean, who in their right mind on the planet would not be very happy that the two most powerful nuclear powers, Russia and the United States, want to get back to normalizing their relations? And if this conflict between Russia and NATO in the Ukraine, because that's what it is, NATO and the Ukraine, or Russia, if it would go on, it could lead to a global nuclear war, which of course would be the end of civilization. So that's definitely a positive element that the security paper the United States just published here a couple of weeks ago. We want this to end, and we want it to end now, and we want to be friends with Russia. And a little bit in the positive direction is the fact that it replaces the previous formulation of China being a threat to now China becoming an economic competitor. I mean, you can live with that. But then there are some other elements which aren't so good, and I think the worst one is the insistence that declares the Western Hemisphere, essentially Central America and Latin America, to essentially be the United States' backyard. It even talks about a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, one could say a better Trump corollary to the Teddy Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. But it basically just says that the Western Hemisphere is the sphere of influence for the United States, which, of course, relates to the pending invasion of Venezuela associated with this, where there is a pretext of war. The pretext is based on drugs. But the reality, if you really look at this, as I've been trying to explain in several programs over the last month, that the real aim of this anti-Venezuela scenario is to drive out the influence of Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba from Latin America. The powers that be do not want these powers that be to have influence on this side of the planet, which forebodes a big destabilization, of course. And while the United States simply does not have the land forces to invade and occupy Venezuela, we could still do an awful lot of damage. I mean, it could throw the entire continent of Latin America into complete turbulence, where the aim obviously would be to favor those economically libertarian governments that are willing to use the famous chainsaw approach that Milei has done in Argentina and in other countries like Bolsonaro in Brazil. And this is a very troubled area in the world following this new strategy paper. Now, do you know how big Venezuela is? Have you looked at it, compared it? It's bigger than Texas. It's not as big as the Ukraine, but it's bigger than Texas. What the hell are we doing there? Now, the part of the claim is that we want their oil. Well, Maduro has already told Trump in conversations that have been made public, hey, let's work something out here. You want a better deal on the oil? Come on down here and let's work it out. You don't have to invade Venezuela to get the oil and the gas. But because of the tremendous influence that Russia and China and Iran and Cuba are exhibiting in South American countries, especially Peru and the Chancay harbor that's being built, that's up and operating under Chinese money. That's the real problem. Real problem from the idea of the Western Hemisphere dominating the planet kind of thinking. Now, in respect to Europe, this paper says essentially that all hell has broken loose. It says there's a complete lack of democracy. There is a concerted effort to suppress the opposition, as if we don't do what we can in this country to suppress the opposition. But just look at what the ICE policy is doing against the migrants. And then it says that if Europe does not shape up, looking down the road 20 years from now, there may be a civilizational seizure. That's what it was. Civilizational seizure of Europe. I mean, that's pretty heavy language. It basically is saying in this United States security paper that in 20 years, Europe as a civilization could disappear. Now, not for reasons in the strategy paper, that's been discussed before. But if Europe does not change its current economic and cultural policies, it could vanish as a civilization easily, just a relic in some future museum. Here in this display over here was a country called France. Here's what they contributed to culture. Here's what they contributed to architecture. It's not there anymore. It's kind of a mumbly pig mix-up of several different ethnic groups here, largely from the massive immigration from Africa that now controls these parts of what was once Europe. I mean, I can see that. I can see that in a museum. But the biggest problem right now is what's the reaction to the Europeans to this U.S. security paper? The Ukraine war, which from the very beginning was a proxy war simply of NATO against Russia, which extended even further the 5-time NATO expansions that happened after the Cold War, which it promised would never happen, but it did. And NATO did expand 1,000 kilometers to the east to the borders of Russia, putting potentially offensive weapon systems into Poland, Romania, which reduced the warning time of any missile attack on Moscow to 5 to 7 minutes. But when it was clear that this was even expanding further, Russia started the special military operation in the Ukraine. That was almost 4 years ago now. And as was clear from the beginning, this war could never have been won by the Ukraine, given the fact that Russia has vast military superiority. And even if NATO supplies all kinds of weapons systems to the Ukraine, if we stop doing it and Europe does, it's not going to compensate for the fact that the Ukrainian population is much smaller, has decreased by at least 50% since the war broke out due to emigration, desertion from the military, and the casualties of war. So this war is almost at an end now. It has been simply a war of attrition, and there's hardly anything left to attrit. But what are the Europeans doing? Now, not all Europeans, but the so-called coalition of the willing. The countries of Great Britain, France, Germany, and you could add Poland. You could probably add the Baltic countries, probably add Scandinavia, but especially the big three, Germany, France, and Great Britain. They have formed this E3 Europe, E3, namely a coalition of the willing intending to carry on the war until there is this proposed strategic defeat of Russia. Now that is impossible. You cannot defeat Russia for the very simple reason that at this point in time, Russia is the strongest nuclear power on the planet. And what will Russia do before it allows itself to be destroyed? It will use these nuclear weapons, as has been stated in the latest update of their nuclear doctrine. And it has been repeated by President Putin and other Russian officials many times. So what does it mean that the coalition of the willing is saying that they still want to continue the war until there's a strategic defeat of Russia? It simply means they're out there on the front line pushing and risking nuclear war. And the argument, obviously, is that Russia is not going to stop in the Ukraine. Once Russia has dominated the Ukraine, then they're going to attack other European NATO countries. Some people who are totally crazy say it could happen right away. Others say Russia needs 5 years to build up its nuclear and conventional forces. But Rutte, the General Secretary of the NATO, just, 3 or 4 days ago in Berlin, at an event of the Munich Security Conference, where he made a speech which was absolutely unbelievable. I think I reported on it last week. He said Russia is preparing an incredible war where total destruction. This is what he said. This is the General Secretary of NATO. This isn't some junior officer. This isn't some account executive. This is the General Secretary. He said this, that Russia is preparing an incredible war where total destruction will come to every European home. There will be mass mobilizations, millions of displaced people, unlimited suffering, and extreme losses. Therefore, Europe has to get ready for the kind of war which was fought by our grandparents and great-grandparents. So we have to be ready to do what our grandparents and great-grandparents did when they fought World War I and World War II. This is completely impossible. Because if it ever comes to a war, it's going to be nuclear, not conventional. And it's also a lie, because what Rutte is saying when he says we have to do what our parents and our grandparents did, who was the attacker in World War II? It wasn't Russia. It wasn't the Soviet Union. It wasn't China in the Pacific. So, to get an idea of the mindset of these crazies, you have to go back a little bit, and climate change. Let me say something about climate change in relation to the way they're looking at this kind of stuff. Is that it's still part of the battle cry, not only the destruction of Russia as a military power, but right alongside of it, they keep pushing this climate change stuff. And the human mind has enough troubles battling just getting your day started, getting out to work, doing the kinds of things that are necessary to provide for yourself, for your families. And we tend to forget that not everything about war is new. We understand the trends, maybe not the timeline, and we get so wrapped up in what's necessary for our own preservation that we miss this vision of a future of war that escapes a lot of us. And on the other hand, it becomes the end, or it becomes the suitable end for the distress that's in our minds, knowing that somehow programmed in the back of our heads that war is in the long run inevitable. But for NATO, this means that they have no time to lose, that tomorrow is today, and that should your challenge, should you choose to accept it, Ethan, is to take this foresight to a war fight and to get ready for it now. That's the attitude in Europe. And the people who are putting out this kind of crap are absolutely insane. They should be locked up in one of these psychiatric clinics where they're behind 3 sets of barbed wire and bars and steel and heavily medicated before they get back out in the public, especially in the area of public policy. I mean, the idea that war will be forever among us is completely insane. It has this image of man, that man is just absolutely barbaric and has to be controlled at every turn. Now, it was this speech of Rutte, the General Secretary of NATO, that NATO may have to make a preemptive attack on Russia, which basically is the idea of man being incapable of ever becoming human in a true sense, and that to the victor goes the spoils, and the quicker we become the victor, the greater we get the spoils of a defeated Russia, and finally peace can reign upon this planet. And of course, what they mean by peace is not what we mean by peace. So you can ask yourself, what is wrong with the Western elites that only 80 years now after the end of World War II, the memory of what war does is no longer alive in the minds of these people? I mean, the YouTube is full of videos to show you what war is if you haven't experienced it. Enough footage, films, and things like that are there to give you an idea of what war is really like. That they should not be ready to risk not only the war of their grandparents and great-grandparents, but to risk a war that would lead only to one conclusion: nuclear annihilation. Now, this absolutely insane vision of the future is not shared by the citizens of these countries. It's shared by those who, like the leaders of our country, who've been bought and sold 10 times over by various interest groups to make sure that the foreign policies, domestic policies, fit in with the thinking of the billionaire oligarchs who owned them, to the donors to their parties who owned them, and no longer to something as simple as, Farmer Smith or car manufacturer Jones. And this entire effort to build this unipolar world where you have complete dominance by the Western military powers. At the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, has failed so completely. It utterly turned into a blowback, whereby you now have the countries of the global South together forming a new economic system with the BRICS, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and even NATO is split between parts of Europe that want to continue the war and a few of the more eastern countries in NATO who want nothing to do with it. And so there's this rift in this transatlantic alliance, and the fact that Europe is in an economic free fall right now, and the United States also is not in the greatest shape economically. I mean, if you doubt that, just a little deeper tour inside America's largest cities, where the infrastructure is collapsing, suicide rates are higher than ever, the general outlook of the population is very polarized, full of despair. So why is it that the Western elites are so absolutely incapable of reflecting on the fact that the condition of the world as it exists today is the result of their own mistakes? Now, who was the one who brokered the peace settlement between Russia and the Ukraine in the spring of 2022? You remember? I'm not talking about the Istanbul negotiations. One who brokered the peace settlement. It was those politicians who suffered the same demoralizing conclusions that you have right now at the heart and core of this flawless European Commission. It was the British, by way of the Brexit Brits, whom all of Europe is now chasing after. They want to become Brexit people. And also a very interesting phenomenon that the American government under Joe Biden, where the whole EU establishment had nothing better to do than to submit to what Biden wanted. And now, as we get more information that what Biden wanted and sent out was signed by an auto pen, then we know that it's coming from the people in the White House, not from Biden. And so, so much for independence, so much for self-confidence, so much for a strong Europe. It was deluded people like these leaders, the leaders of the E3, who issued that slogan that victory absolutely must be achieved on the battlefield, and that there can be no peace settlement. The only end to this hostile invasion by Russia will be the end of the Russian military machine. And now there's hundreds of thousands of deaths. And probably for the widespread destruction of what's left of the Ukraine. And for billions in debt that's going to indebt further Ukrainian generations. But not just the Ukrainian generation. All these other European countries who've put in billions upon tens of billions of euros to defeat this Russian war machine. Now, if you listen to this stuff coming from these European politicians accusing the establishments of the pro-war factions in Europe of having caused the deaths of millions of people, of having prevented the peace when it was possible in March of 2022. That's just one voice. I mean, you can imagine if the continuation of the present policies of the Western system lead to the inevitable collapse of the financial system that we are sitting on right now, on this financial bubble worse than what blew apart in 2008 with the Lehman Brothers crisis. That you could have a collapse of the system by dimensions which are just almost unimaginable. And so what is hanging over the heads of these people is the fear that they may be called to account for the policies that they've imposed upon the world. It's kind of like Zelensky and how the Ukrainian people feel about him, which is why he doesn't hang out inside the Ukraine. I mean, this is the only explanation I can come up with for why they continue a policy which has absolutely failed. And they insist on continuing with policies which they've created the present havoc in the present world situation because of their careers, the prestige, the privileges that go with these positions, and the fact that they're absolutely irrational. So when we saw and talked about on this show, as was talked about on other shows, of preventive war against Russia, and that kind of propaganda that was coming out of NATO, trying to defend why NATO should be bigger than it was, during a period of time when it became increasingly obvious that NATO was obsolete. Should have happened in 1991, when the Warsaw Pact dissolved, 1991. NATO has definitely outlived its legitimacy. And it must be replaced by a new security and developmental architecture, which this time has to take into account what we have said so many times on this show, the security and developmental interests of every single country on this planet. That's the only way out of this crisis. I mean, we have such an incredible crisis where not only the Ukraine war, but also these other regional crises could eventually lead to global nuclear war. And that's definitely the case for the Middle East, where the genocide going on in Gaza is continuing despite the so-called peace plan of Trump. And then this terrorist attack that just happened this weekend in Bondi Beach in Australia. 12 people killed, 30 wounded at a Hanukkah light festival for the Jewish community. Immediately, Netanyahu said that this was an attack on all of Judaism. And it's a result of the fact that the leaders of the world have stopped fighting anti-Semitism. I would not be surprised if some military action in the Middle East could result from this, using the terrorist incident as an excuse, because Netanyahu is trying to link what happened at Bondi Beach in Sydney to Iran. And if it comes to a larger war in the Middle East, including Iran, that also has the potential to lead to nuclear war. And these tensions growing between China and Japan, where the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi declared that it would be an existential threat to Japan if mainland China tried to unify Taiwan into China militarily. Do you know why China has not gone after Taiwan militarily? Because the concurrent ruling government in China, or in Taiwan, wants Taiwan to be like Hong Kong, part of mainland China, but a separate autonomy, but still a part of China, where Taiwan can go on being Taiwan, which would negate the need for any kind of military action in that part of the world at all. But it's the global, the Western global hegemony that's in its dying stages that wants some military action to take place there to justify the fact that NATO needs to expand to the east. And naturally, if Latin America conflict escalates, especially in Venezuela, that could have tremendous potential. So if you have a world which is in such disarray, you cannot try to solve these problems one by one. I mean, even if they have their historical and factual specificity in and of themselves, each crisis has its own reasons. I mean, they're all part of the overall development where you have the end of the system of 500 years of colonialism and the emergence of a new system whereby the countries of the global majority are trying to create a new, more just system. And the conflict is the deeper reason behind all these regional expressions of conflict, because you have to try to solve this in totality. And the only way to do that is to establish a new security and development architecture which emphatically cannot be partial to any one country. It has to take into account the interests of every single country on the planet. This was done once before in history and ended 150 years of religious wars. Now, the religious wars in the Middle East has gone on since the first Nakba, there at the end of the 1940s, May 15th, 1948. Prior to that, they lived in peace. The 1648 Peace of Westphalia ended 150 years of religious wars in Europe. And the different war parties came to the conclusion that they had to have a diplomatic end of the war because it would continue. Everybody would be dead. Nobody would be left alive. And so now today, in the age of nuclear weapons, this is all the more true. So, you know, not just my opinion, but of course it's my opinion that rules and reigns on this program, that we have to replace the present structures of global dominance, NATO and the other security structures, especially the idea of a global NATO, and have such a Westphalian peace agreement which takes into interest the interests of the other. That was the most important principle that was established by the Peace of Westphalia. And now in the world today, there are already some countries offering similar ideas. One of them is China, where Xi Jinping has, in the last several years, offered 4 global initiatives: the global security, the global development, global civilization, and global governance initiatives that would establish world peace based on taking care of one another's interests. China does not want war. China doesn't want world domination. China wants to do business. And it's hard to do business with countries that are at war. Now, it's very clear, I think, that we may well be on the brink of World War III. That is something that's been picked up quite a bit lately by Pope Leo XIV in several of his recent sermons and speeches. The most recent one was to the Italian diplomats on the occasion of the Jubilee, when he said that peace is the duty of humanity, not the church. Peace is the duty of humanity. And he appealed to the famous intervention of Pope Paul VI 60 years ago at the United Nations, when Pope Paul VI said, "No more war, never again," calling for the elimination of war as the means of conflict resolution forever. Now, I think that's definitely something the human species is capable of, because despite the will and the wishes of the military-industrial complex, we are not barbarians. We're not like this NATO image of man. We are a creative species, and we can come up with solutions for every man-made problem. And war just happens to be a man-made problem. There is, even with what I just said, on the doorstep of World War III, this is an absolutely, unbelievably, potentially powerful moment of history for peace at the same time. And the majority of countries, the BRICS countries, the SCO, the other organizations, right now fighting for a process of a system in which every country on the planet has the same rights to economic development and prosperity for its own citizens. So the big task that remains is to prevent those people who still think in terms of war as a means of conflict resolution, like the neocons in America, like most of our House of Representatives and Senate, and the War Party from Europe. They must not be allowed to succeed in their aim. And I'm very optimistic that we have all the means at our disposal to open a whole new chapter of humanity. We really can. We can leave behind this era of imperialism and colonialism, leave it behind and move to this face of humanity where countries relate to each other like members of a family, where each one wants the best for the other and vice versa. And it's, as a species, it's incumbent upon us to turn the future of our species, where we devote our energies, like how to get thermonuclear fusion power, how to defeat disease by getting back to the principles of Mother Nature, how where you can create a much brighter humanity. These are the things that I meditate upon, that I pray for, that I try to aim my programs around: the idea of peace. And it's still possible. It's still possible because we still maintain some degree of our humanity. Now, I was going to say something about this thing in Australia, but I think I've said enough as far as these world things are concerned. There's some other stuff that I want to get to in the 20 minutes that are left that I thought was rather interesting. You might find it interesting. One is about this that Britain is now openly admitting they have soldiers in the Ukraine. Are the Germans so quick to admit that? Are the French so quick? Is the United States so quick to admit that we have a fighting force in the Ukraine? We know that a lot of the missile systems, offensive and defensive missile systems that are present there, cannot be operated by Ukrainians. It has to be operated by Americans. The death of this British paratrooper reported this week was the first public admission by British authorities that a serving member of the British Armed Forces has been killed in the Ukraine. Now, the timing of the official disclosure and its very public, emotive nature raises the question about the motives of the British authorities, because the news of this death comes at a critical moment when London and these other European capitals seem desperate to sabotage the efforts of President Trump to find a peaceful settlement to this nearly 4-year-old conflict now. And Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer led the tributes in the British Parliament on Wednesday to Lance Corporal George Hooley, who was described as a hero who served our country in the cause of freedom and democracy. And as you might suspect, the British media was plastered with all these photos and sentimental commendations of this dead paratrooper. And Britain's Minister of Defense, John Healey, said, "George's tragic death reminds us of the courage and commitment with which our outstanding armed forces serve every day to protect our nation." Now, I want you to tell me what's wrong with that statement. I'm sorry for old George Hooley, the paratrooper who was killed in Ukraine. We're not really sure how he died, but he's dead. But this is what the Minister of Defense said. This would be like Hegseth saying something about a dead soldier in Venezuela being a hero in keeping America safe. So this is what the Minister of Defense said. "George's tragic death reminds us of the courage and commitment with which our outstanding armed forces serve every day to protect our nation." Now, how exactly British soldiers are protecting Britain wasn't explained in that statement. So the Sun newspaper went further to whip up a bunch of anti-Russian feelings when it subsequently reported that the Kremlin made disgusting comments about the death of the soldier. Moscow had simply dared to ask what the British soldier was doing in the Ukraine in the first place, and pointing out that British personnel have been participating in terrorist attacks on Russian civilian centers along with Ukrainian military units. Well, we know that. It's been filmed, it's been videoed. We know that. Ukrainian forces have been firing UK-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles into Russian territory for over 2 years now. These missiles cannot be operated without British personnel on the ground. Similarly, the American high-made HIMARS and ATACMS, which have also targeted Russian territory, have also necessarily involved U.S. personnel for operations, as I said earlier. And it's an open secret that the British, the French, the Americans, the Polish, the Germans, and other NATO forces have been deployed in the Ukraine to fight against the Russian military. Up till now, the NATO authorities have maintained a very cynical silence about their involvement, pretending that the estimated 30,000 foreign soldiers in the Ukraine are private mercenaries who have no official affiliation. So Russia's warnings about NATO being a direct participant in war have been dismissed as Kremlin propaganda. So when Russian drones find these foreign mercenaries and they accuse these countries of being behind it, these countries come out and say, it's just Kremlin propaganda. But Moscow's claims have been previously corroborated. There are Pentagon classified documents leaked back in 2023 indicated that 50 British special forces were deployed in Ukraine, making up the biggest contingency of other NATO commandos in combat with Russia. Then just last year, in March of 24, there was this leaked audio recording of Germany's Luftwaffe commander, Lieutenant General Ingo Gerhardt, and it was released in which he told other top officials that the British forces were on the ground operating Storm Shadow missiles. Then the British elite forces from the SAS, which work in conjunction with the paratroop regiments, are known to operate underwater drones in the Black Sea to target the Crimea. Now, it is now estimated that 40 British nationals have been killed in combat in the Ukraine, along with other NATO nationals. However, the American, the British, the French, and other authorities have kept a very stony silence about the identities and the circumstances, implying that the casualties were private mercenaries and soldiers of fortune and were not representative of our particular military force. Now, logically, the NATO powers want to deny the depth of their involvement in the conflict. They're supposed to merely support Ukraine with weapons to defend against the Russian aggression. And the admission of NATO armed forces on the ground is an acknowledgement of the reality that the U.S.-led military alliance is at war with Russia. So we talk about the proxy war of NATO against Russia, and we know who NATO is. NATO is the United States. So it's the United States war against Russia. And many independent observers already know this as fact, as does Russia. Still, it kind of behooves the NATO states to suppress the truth, and on their part, try and maintain some plausible deniability. Now, Russia has said, with justification, that all combatants in the Ukraine are justifiable, legitimate targets. That includes members of the armed forces who claim to be peacekeepers, or people who are present who are acting as military advisors. And given the secrecy that Britain and other NATO nations have maintained about deployment in the Ukraine over previous military casualties, it does seem a little bit strange that just this week of all weeks, we see this public announcement about the death of a paratrooper who obviously wasn't there as some kind of a mercenary force, but was in fact there representing British military, far from the front lines. And so that disclosure appears to be aimed at portraying the soldier in some minimal role working on defense, and then with all these eulogies in the British media for this paratrooper as an honorable person. Obviously, it's trying to rally public support for more British soldiers in the Ukraine and anger towards Russia, who killed this poor, beautiful little boy. I think you can expect various provocations and maneuvers to escalate this conflict to avoid peace, but declaring the death of a British soldier should be a damning admission of NATO being at war behind the backs of the public, hiding behind the public through the content and cover of NATO states. But rather than an admission of culpability, the British authorities, as with European NATO leaders, are trying to rouse public support for an escalation. And then with what Rudy said, that the European nations have to be ready for full-scale war with Russia like our grandfathers endured. I mean, the insane European losers want to save their political necks with World War III. All right, now, as I have said many times, talking about Big Pharma on my health show, Big Pharma has a mission, and that is to expand the power, the control, and the income of Big Pharma. They're not really there for a whole lot of other reasons. And so the mission of the American Heart Association stated is to do what can be done, to bring down the numbers of heart attacks, but it's not really supporting the kind of effort that would actually result in that. Same thing with the cancer group, the diabetes group, the obesity groups. And one of the most insidious, most powerful branches of Big Pharma is the American Academy of Pediatrics. And you would think that's a branch of medicine that was devoted to the health of children. When you consider the current state of the health of children in America, what kind of a job is the American Academy of Pediatrics actually doing? And now they are demanding, foot-stomping, demanding the elimination of childhood vaccine exemptions. Just as more and more states are passing religious exemptions for childhood vaccinations, the American Academy is getting very, very upset. Do you know why? Whenever you're discussing anything that involves a major national movement or something that involves thousands upon thousands of people, you know what's always at the heart and core, right? Money. And one of the largest sources of income to any pediatrician is vaccinations. In fact, we know, it's beyond argument, if a certain percentage of their patient load is fully vaccinated, that doctor gets tremendous bonuses and kickbacks from Big Pharma. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics has issued a policy statement in which it advocates the wholesale totalitarian revocation of any non-medical exemption granted to children attending any school. Here it is. I'm going to read it to you. It's not very long. Routine childhood immunizations against infectious diseases are an integral part of our public health infrastructure. They provide direct protection to the immunized individual and indirect protection to children and adults unable to be immunized by reducing spread of vaccine-preventable diseases in the community. There's so many assumptions in those two sentences. All 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico have regulations requiring proof of immunization as a condition for child care and school attendance as a public health strategy to protect children in these settings and to secondarily serve as a mechanism to promote timely immunization of children by their caregivers. Although all states and the District of Columbia have mechanisms to exempt school attendees from specific immunizations for medical reasons, the majority also have a heterogeneous collection of regulations and laws that allow non-medical reasons for exemption. The American Academy of Pediatrics supports certification of immunization to attend child care and school as a sound means of providing a safe environment for attendees and employees at these settings. The American Academy of Pediatrics also supports medically indicated exemptions to specific immunizations as determined for each individual child. The American Academy of Physicians advocates for the elimination of non-medical exemptions from immunizations as contrary to optimal individual and public health. Unmentioned in this statement, curiously, for an organization held in such high esteem that touts its slavish devotion to science, constantly smearing its critics as grifters, is that the American Academy of Physicians has a financial stake, as I said, in forcing all children, even in violation of their parents' wishes, to take pharmaceutical products, in that the corporations that produce said products are their sponsors. Where does the money come from that supports the American Academy of Pediatrics? You won't have to think too deep on that one. Now, in ethics, which the pharmaceutical industry is not all that interested in, taking cash from corporations whose products you then pimp under the auspices of promoting the general welfare is something that we call a conflict of interest. Now, the ultimate vaccine pimp, Paul Offit, of course, aggressively defends the metal adjuvants in childhood vaccines. He said if you alter the vaccine injury compensation program, he says, make no doubt about that is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s interest. And he's already hired a law firm out of Arizona with the goal of altering it. What I predict is going to happen. You're going to see RFK Jr. holding up some paper that he's going to publish in a journal that's a fringe journal called Science, Public Health, and the Law that says aluminum adjuvants in vaccines are causing harm. Now, Offit said this: there's no taking aluminum adjuvants out of vaccines. There are certain vaccines that just need adjuvants to get a better immune response. What he's then going to do is he's going to say, see, this is causing autism. They'll add that to the vaccine compensation injury program, which will break the program. Let's leave pharmaceutical corporations open to the slings and arrows of outrageous civil litigation. Yeah, he owns a multitude of vaccine patents himself. Of course he's against this. But he says here, they'll add that to the vaccine compensation injury program, which will break that program. Why would it break the program? Because of the flood of vaccine injuries. Outrageous. What if half the effort of these monsters devoting to metals in the vaccines were spent trying to develop non-toxic, non-metal adjuvants that did not pose the same health risk? For that to make any sense, you'd have to assume that poisoning children, thereby creating lifelong medical industry customers, isn't actually central to the vaccine agenda. Yeah, I said that. All right. My half price for brand new patients at the clinic continues. You need to call the office to schedule a free consultation, 801-523-1890. I've got several of them this week already, but there's a space for a couple more as we plow towards the end of 2025. We are going to come right up to the end of the program here in just a few moments. In fact, I'm going to end the recording as of now, and I'm going to play what was playing on there before to continue the K-Talk broadcast as I separate myself from K-Talk. And for those of you on the stream, thanks for being a part of the program. We'll pick up some of these ideas tomorrow, but be safe out there. I also have gift certificates. If you'd like to help somebody along with our care, we have gift certificates. So keep your wits about you. Watch out for the other guys out there. There's a lot of them.